want to do is define this thing, digital civil society, which I named the lab after, but those days I can barely pronounce. There's too many I's in there. This is the definition that we use. Is this not working? Okay, I'll just talk really loud. I'm from New York. Nobody's ever needed me to be loud. It's all the ways that we use our private, that we voluntarily use our private resources for public benefit. I realize just now that this is missing the keyword voluntarily, but it's all the way we voluntarily use our private resources for public benefit in the digital age. And what I want to try to convince you of in the next 20 minutes is that those last couple of words in the digital age are not just slapped on there and doesn't mean anything. We undertook several years of research before launching the lab at Stanford to figure out what it was that was really changing things around us, and it's this set of digital dependencies that we've developed as individuals, as organizations, and as societies. And until we can understand and take back those dependencies, we're going to be swimming upstream a bit. So in particular, when you think about philanthropy and civil society, for the most part, we think we have three resources that we're interested in donating or contributing in some way to public benefit. We know all about contributing time, and we know a lot about contributing money. But has anybody here actually ever deliberately contributed your digital data to make the world a better place? Do you think you've done it not deliberately? Yeah, maybe. You've also probably done it not deliberately into what you might not think is a better place. So let me talk a little bit about what it means to contribute your digital data. But in order to do that, I have to make sure that all of you actually understand what it is that's different about digital data. So raise your hand if you've got a smartphone, if you have a phone on your pocket. Anybody here know how it works? That's 100%. Anybody here know how it works? Amazing. You're carrying this thing around. You're probably dependent on it. I'll let you decide that for yourself. But you don't know how it works. That's not an accident, by the way. I used the term during the panel of learned helplessness. Let me be very clear. You do not sell billions of devices if the consumers have to understand how they work. They're designed so that you don't need to know how they work. That's on purpose. It's not an accident. And it's not you. It's not that you are not smart enough to be one of the 30, and I argue with Phil all day about that number, people who can design these things. It's that you haven't been given a chance to, or maybe in this particular audience you had an opportunity, but you didn't choose to pursue it. But there are billions of people around the world who haven't had the chance. This is not accidental. This is by design. So I need somebody I don't know to take out their phone, unlock it, and give it to me. Thank you. And I need somebody I don't know to take out some Swedish kroner and give them to me. This is a philanthropy conference, right? Isn't this how this works? There's no cash? Then any other currency. I can't take a credit card. I can't take your digital version. I need any other currency. Perfect. Thank you. All right. First of all, what a bunch of gullible people you are. Thank you. That's trust in action. Never underestimate how important that is. Who has the bill and the phone? Who doesn't? Everyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to capitalism. That is, and any economists in the room? It's a rival economic good. Our entire modern society, going back 1,000 years, depends on that nature of the resource. I have it and you don't. That is also, by the way, at the root of modern philanthropy. Not necessarily the kind that the gentleman who was sitting here earlier was talking about, but the kind that we privilege and count. It's based on a rival resource. I have it, you don't. Money works that way. Time works that way. And the physical phone works that way. We've built everything you're familiar with around that nature of the resource. This is not a small change. It's a big change. Because what about the data on, what's your name? Sean's phone. Who has access to the data on Sean's phone, which, by the way, remember, is unlocked? I do. Who else? Sean. Who else? Microsoft, Apple, Facebook. Who else? Trump. Yes. My government. Who else? Saudi Arabia. Who else? Google. We've mentioned the companies. We've mentioned the US government. We've mentioned me. Who else? Anyone who can buy it. Who else? this place, the National Museum, the Swedish government, a whole bunch of governments, all at the same time, all the time. Not occasionally, not when they want it, but all the time. But just go back to, I think you have not mentioned one critical person who also has access to the data. Me and Sean, simultaneously, at the same time. That makes it very different from this. Totally different from this. It's the difference, it's how different water is from land. It's a completely different economic resource. And we go along carrying these things in our pockets thinking, oh, I'm just doing my same old thing. It's not the same old thing. It's a fundamentally different thing. It's so fundamentally different that for those same 1,000 years that we've been developing companies and enterprises and nonprofits and philanthropy to manage this kind of resource, when we've had the kind of resources that act the way the digitized data do, that non-rival, many of us can use it at once, you know who we've depended on to build those things? Here in Sweden, you should know, you do it more than, certainly more than my country. The government. Non-rival resources, things like lighthouses and roads and armies, things that lots of people use at once. Those are what we build governments around. But now we've built this resource that we all depend on, you just admitted to it. You're part of building it, and private companies, most of whom, 6 of whom at least, are based in my backyard, not yours, control. So yeah, it's a powerful thing, but it is fundamentally, changing the ground on which we stand. And we can understand it, and we can make it work for us. It already does let us do incredible things that we haven't been able to do. But we can't do those things if we just go on acting like, oh, it's too complicated, I can't ever understand this. Do you understand the difference now between the money and the data? You just got a PhD in, digital. Don't go telling me that you don't get it. You do get it. And to the degree that you don't get it, remember there's somebody out there who's got a vested interest in you thinking you don't get it. Okay? You get it. You can get it. We can change this. I don't know whose phone or money I have, so they're up for grabs. That's because it's never the same person. It's never the same person who does that. So there you have it. That's how fundamentally different the digital environment is. Now, wherever you work, do you have an email address? So you are digitally dependent. I also want to dissuade you of the notion that you're only a digital foundation or only a digital nonprofit or only a digital activist if you've got Insta, Snapgram, Twitter, analytics. Who cares? If you're using these devices to bring people together, communicate, or create information, in other words, you use a laptop that's connected to the internet, or a phone, more likely, then you are digitally dependent. That's what we're talking about. And the question is then, what happens to all that resource, that data? How can you take control of it? Now, this is already happening. Again, this is not the future. I want to tell you a story about something called Empower. Have anybody heard of this? It's a research study. It's a medical research study on Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease, I don't know what the Swedish term for it, but it's a neurological disease that one of the ways it manifests itself is through physical tremors. Okay? And so for people who are researching it, they have a lot of hypotheses about how you could better understand this disease if you could understand the tremors. Has anyone here ever volunteered for a medical research study? And when you did it involve like going to a lab? Like you had to go somewhere. It took a lot of time. Whatever it was, you had to go, you had to be there, maybe you had to go back, all that kind of thing, right? It's wonderful for people to do it. If you don't do it, we don't learn much, right? But medical research is limited by the fact that both you have to be motivated to want to go spend that time, and usually that means somebody participates in a medical research study for one of two reasons. They're a starving college student, and they're getting paid $25 to do it, which gives you a certain population. Or there's somebody who has some relationship to the disease, somebody they know has it, somebody they're related to, they have a personal vested interest in it, which also gives you a certain kind of population that you'll wind up studying, right? So neither of those is particularly great from the research perspective, because what you'd like to have is some appropriately representative set of humans to understand how the disease works. Now, since all of you have supercomputers in your pocket, you're perfect. What if we could find a way to enable you to take the data that's on your phone and donate it for medical research, in particular for Parkinson's research, which means in a particular kind of data, which is I don't want your address, I don't want your friends, I don't want your contact book, I want your movement. Anybody here use your phone to track your steps every day? You're already doing this. I mean, it's already doing it regardless. Your phone is collecting that information. You're just paying attention to it. So Empower was designed by a not-for-profit research group in Seattle, Washington that works just on this issue. How can we help people donate their data for medical research? And a bunch of medical researchers. By the way, all of you with iPhones or Androids, let me guess, that's all of you, right? You've already consented to let people do this. You know this, right? Because you've read the terms of service. Yeah, right? So you've already said, yes, you can do this. Both Apple and Android, which is made by Google, built this into their terms of service that medical researchers can access this information. I'm going to fast forward this. I love this story. I can spend hours telling it. Fast forward, the Sage Bionetworks, the company that creates the consent process, decided if we're going to try to convince you to donate your what's called accelerometer data, that's the movement data on your phone, to this process, we actually would like you to know that you're doing that. What a concept. Oh my God, we might even ask you if you'd like to do it. And when we ask you, we'd like you to actually have, we would like to have some understanding that you know what you're saying yes to. You'd think this was impossible, right? Because you're never treated this way by anyone else. You just scroll down and click I agree, right? So the consent process to donate your data to this research involves, Sean, can I have your phone again? I don't carry one on me. I'm usually the only one in the room, right? I don't care. It wants your motion data. So in order to sign up, first you have to download the app. That usually doesn't happen accidentally. That's one clue that you might be doing this intentionally. Then you have to walk around with it. You have to go like this, because that generates the data. After you've done a few things, you have to swipe across it a few times. In other words, after you've generated the kind of data that the researchers want, then and only then are you in the study. You know how long it takes to do that? 90 seconds. About as long as it takes to scroll through 28 pages of 9-point font and find the darn I agree button, right? But then you're in. You put the phone in your pocket and you're off. And until such time as you decide, you know, I don't want to do that anymore, it's going to collect the data. Now, what it's going to do, it doesn't care where you are in the world. It doesn't care, and I won't go into a long discussion about how accelerometer data is collected on your phone, but it is collected by knowing exactly where in the world you are, which, by the way, is one of the single most re-identifiable types of data there is, even more so than your name. Because think about where you go every day. You go the same places every day. Your routine over a 10-day period, it's a dead giveaway about who you are. The medical researchers couldn't care less where you are. They want to know, did you move 2,000 steps, 5,000 steps, 15,000 steps, or you sat on your tush all day, right? So they wrote the complicated algorithm that only 30 people in the world could ever write. That's not true, Phil. So that it does the math on your phone. Oh, there's Phil. I thought you left. All right? Phil's here. I don't know why you're not there. You're forever going to be that chair, right? Everywhere. They wrote the algorithm so it does the math on your phone. It adds it up. Wow. And that number is what it sends to the medical researchers, because they don't want to know where you are, because that data is sensitive. They designed it to respect your privacy. Thank you, Sean. Here's your phone back. They designed the algorithm to collect only the data they needed for the information, for the questions they had in the research they were trying to do, and they asked your permission in a way that you paid attention to and you understood, and when you don't want to do it anymore, you can get out. Sounds a lot like volunteering at a nonprofit, huh? Things that we in this room know everything there is about. how to ask people to participate in a way that respects their agency and gives them the choice. Anybody here who's ever managed volunteers knows getting them in is only part of the relationship. Mostly they leave. Try getting yourself out of somebody else's data set. That's what we need to invent. That is part of our future. It is, as I keep saying, it's also part of our present. The Empower study is a couple years old at this point. Some takeaway prior to them doing this, the largest number of participants ever in Parkinson's research had been 2,000 people. In the first 6 months of making this available, 10,000 people participated in the study, and very few of them had a direct known relationship to Parkinson's. In other words, the data set was really valuable for researchers. This we can do when we stand up and say, this is how it should be done. And suddenly we're all going to be incredibly wealthy because the amount of digitized data we have to donate is extraordinary. But there's another part of this dynamic of the fact that you all have supercomputers in your pocket and all those other intermediaries, all those AT&Ts and Facebooks and Googles and Ericssons and all of those guys we mentioned before when I asked who was standing between me, Sean, and the data. That system is in our space now all the time. We are dependent on these systems that are, for the most part, built by companies and monitored by governments. My government and your government. Governments, in other words, over which you have no say, as well as those over which you have some say. And companies over which you have very little influence are in the middle of our civil society philanthropic actions all the time when you're using digital. Not maybe, not only if, not occasionally, all the time. So let's design for that. I'm not trying to change it, kinda, sorta, maybe I am, but we have to understand it and design for it. And we have to, because democracy depends on us doing this. This is not a small call to action. This is a huge, urgent call to action. Democracy depends on some distinction between the markets and the government and this weird civil society thing, which I defined earlier as everything bigger than the family and smaller than the other two. It's a voluntary space. These are private resources, whether they're owned by a company and the group that decides is a company, or it's a group of people in Uppsala who decided to get together and make change in the local park system, or decided to protest against the government. It's a private voluntary space. And it's separate from the other two for a reason. It balances the power. And if we allow that digital dependence to just be the way it is, if we let civil society melt into the government and into the private sector, not only do we not, there's no reason for us anymore, but democracy will stumble. We're living through this right now. This is not like a hypothesis. This is democracy theories and history coming to home to roost right now. So it's not just a matter of thinking, can I put AI to work? Can I use it? Can I get more data and make more sense of it? It's about actually stopping as a sector and saying, how do we reclaim our independence and continue to use these tools? Because I'm not going to ask you to give up your cell phone because you'd run me out of the building, right? That's our reality. How do we reshape the governance systems and the practices within it to make sure that there remains a place for voluntary private action? If we don't protect it, nobody else is. So the good news is there's lots of answers. And again, they're not far in the future. They're happening right here and now. But all of us need to think about how we engage with this so that we can engage in these bigger challenges. So there's 4 kinds of change at the lab The lab thinks there are 4 kinds of change that need to happen. Now, we may be missing some, so I'm all ears. Help me understand better. Lab is only 5 years old. There are technological changes, there are organizational changes, there are legal changes, and there are social changes. And if we make progress on all of those collectively here in Sweden and around the world, we will reclaim and strengthen and nurture a space for voluntary private action in the digital age. So let me give you some examples of how this is already happening. Now I'm going to use 2 words, decentralized and encrypted, which you know as blockchain, right? Now, I'm not saying, let me be very clear, I am not saying that blockchain will save civil society. It won't. But to think about new technological designs that do things that civil society may, in some instances, need, is the way we need to be thinking about technology. This is not about how can I use an algorithm that a company developed for its purposes, for my purposes. It is about developing technology that serves our purposes, which, by the way, the internet was originally designed to do. In fact, the internet has strayed so far from what it was designed to do that the very same 3 old white guys who built it are calling for it to be built again. Now I say, great, and you 3 guys, you invented the World Wide Web. And you know what? The world showed up. So let's collectively reinvent this thing. Not the 3 white guys, not the 3 guys who had the opportunity 40 years ago, but all of us, because we all depend on it. So conversations about the shape and governance of the internet, conversations about telecommunications policies, engagement in things like intellectual property law, those are the things that shape the internet. Yes, and in fact, new technologies like things that are decentralized and encrypted, they matter to you, those policies matter to you, those technologies matter to you. Let's go create them. There's another piece of this. There's something called the self-sovereign identity movement. Chances are conversations are robust here in Stockholm about things like digital personal wallets and ways that would enable you to make better choices about what, when you interact on the web or on your phone, what data you share with whom. That's about a half step toward what I'm talking about. You have a right to your identity in physical space. You decide what you tell somebody when you meet them in person. You decide what you start with, what information you're going to give them. There is absolutely no technological reason you shouldn't have that same power online. Let's go build it. That's part of the discussion about what is ridiculously clearly named by a technologist and not a marketer, self-sovereign identity. It means you're you decide. And you can take it back. Can we build technology that does that? You bet. In fact, there were 25 patents filed for this in 1990. All of us have grown up on an internet that doesn't work this way because somebody found a business model called advertising that didn't want this. But we can take it back. The technology is the easy part. And trust me, there's way more than 30 people on the planet who can design these. I'm going to hammer him for it. You're never going to live it down, Phil. It's just not true, and it's dangerous to talk about something that billions of people depend on as if there are 30 people on the planet who can build it. That is not true. And if it were true, then revolution would be precisely what we needed. It's just not true. You can do this. How many people in this room speak more than 1 language? Congratulations. You are doctoral candidates in decoding complex symbolic systems, which is precisely the degree you'd get at Stanford if you wanted to be one of those people. And you know who taught you how to do it? You do know who taught you how to do that, don't you? Probably your mother. So go home and thank her. Yesterday was Mother's Day, right? That learned helplessness is not helping, so unlearn it. We need new technology. We also need new organizations. We need to really think differently about what we call either NGOs or NPOs, right? What are they? Well, nowadays, they tend to be all over the world. There may be 8 people coordinating hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of volunteers. Why on earth would you stick that inside a hierarchical organization with a tax code benefit in the United States of America? I mean, that's insane. This is how change works now. If you're not familiar with the Missing Maps program, you have that thing in your pocket, you can look it up. The Missing Maps program is a technologically enabled way in which the 90 of us in this room, or hundreds of people, thousands of people around the world, can build real-time maps that show the actual accessibility of a road after a storm or a flood or an earthquake, so that disaster responders can get to where they need to go. Because it might be nice that the Google map shows you that there's a road there, but if it doesn't show you that the road collapsed yesterday, that's not a great place to send an ambulance. But this is what volunteering looks like today. It can happen globally, in real time, with very little human paid support, but in order for this to happen, the digital technologies, the satellite pictures of the maps need to be accessible to all of us and not just to the engineers at Google. Now that's possible. There are companies sending up tiny little satellites taking real-life photographs of every inch of the planet, and this kind of activism is finding terrorist behavior, it's helping in disaster response, it's changing the nature of refugee services. This is what volunteering and activism and civil society can be, as long as we can continue to have, as people, access to the data, which are those satellite images. There's a whole bunch of philanthropy wrapped up in that sentence. Think about it. We also need to reconsider this hierarchical structure known as the NGO or the nonprofit. What if the 90 of us here today decided we were going to go make some change? That we actually found a common purpose, and we said, no, that's actually really worth acting on. It's not going to take a ton of money, but it's going to take some. Mostly it's going to take some coordination. And it might take a long time. So we need to build an institution. No, you don't. You need a way to hold yourselves accountable to each other for the contributions of time and money. And maybe if we're going to get some money from someone who's not in the room, hold ourselves accountable to them. That's what we need. Setting up a nonprofit or an NGO is what we would do, because that's what exists, because we built it 120 years ago. But it's not what we need. We need a way to make decisions together, manage the resources toward mission, and be accountable for it. Open Collective allows you to do that. It's a whole new kind of organization built on top of a 5,000-year-old type of organization called collective decision-making, made by humans. But we can facilitate it with technology. Again, pretty new idea, launched by an Argentine democracy activist. I think she went live with this in the middle of last calendar year. She had set herself a goal of testing it in the real world with 500 real groups so that she could work out the nature of the relationship, the nature of the accountability, the nature of access to the software, the financing, all that kind of stuff. She hit those 500 groups in like a month and had to stop taking new groups. But there are whole new ways to think about the organizational form when you recognize the resources you have at your disposal. I mentioned we need new tech, we need new organizations. I'm up to the third one. We need new laws. Thank you, Europe. Now, it's not perfect. And many of you may actually think of the GDPR as a big compliance headache. That's usually what nonprofits tell me. It's a big compliance headache. It's also the literal encoding of your right as a human to your data. So I'll say it again, as a citizen of the United States. Thank you, Europe. It's not perfect. We can make it better. But it says, look, we live in a digital time. We have these digital representations of ourselves. They're called data. They should be protected. We should have rights about them. And companies and governments are starting to pay attention to it. We need more. It came from, by the way, anybody ever stopped to ask yourself, oh my God, the GDPR, last May, the whole world was like, oh my God, where did it come from? Laws just don't come from nowhere. Somebody puts pressure on a political system to make them. Ask yourselves, you think it was the big 6 tech companies in the US that asked for this law? Nah, probably not. The big 3 in China? Yeah, probably not. It was the people and civil society in Europe. Again, it's not a perfect law, but it's one that says our data are ours. Let's carry that into the digital space and protect it. It's a good start. There's also a recognition that our rules that we've written for analog war and analog conflict, analog humanitarian age, also don't fit so well. So there's a call, this has not yet happened, but those of you in the room who work at Microsoft might recognize this, because there has been a repeated several-year-long campaign to create a digital Geneva Convention. But you know who's leading the charge? It's not the Swiss. It's not even a nation state. It's Microsoft. Saying this is where this matters. Let's get together and figure out the rules of the road. That's extraordinary. We don't usually have companies calling for global laws and global treaties. Again, it hasn't happened, but it could, and we should be part of that. And we need to change the way we use our devices. This is the 4th area of change, the social norms. This is actually something that my lab doesn't do much of, but it's happening and it's important. How many of you have updated to the latest version of the iOS or Android software on your phone? Okay, every hand in the room should go up. It's basic security. If you think you don't understand digital security, step 1, upgrade. Every time, it takes 90 seconds. Sometimes a little longer. Put the phone down for 90 seconds and talk to somebody and upgrade. That's the end of my lecture on that. What's important about it, when you did it, did you notice that you can now be shown how much time you spend on your phone? Any of you using that feature? Yeah. Anybody actually diminish the amount of time you spend on your phone because it shows you that you just wasted 45 minutes on Instagram? Good for you. But did you ask yourself, why on earth is my device maker suddenly showing me how much time I waste on their device? That's like, you know, the spaghetti company telling you you eat too much starch. How'd it get there? What's that doing there? Did you ask? Do you know? It's getting there, and it's doing that because a bunch of people in civil society said, hey, device makers, the way you structure that space, that literally the interface between me and the internet, me and digital, shapes how I use it. It's probably more powerful than legal laws. So give us, you have all this information. By the way, the device makers have always had that information. They know how much time you waste on Instagram. But through pressure from civil society, they were convinced to show it back to you, at the risk that you might use their device less. Now, not everybody said, yeah, I look at it and I use my device less. And when I ask Stanford students this, most of them say, yeah, I just look at it. So, but point here, we can change the tech companies, and we must consider the tech companies and our device makers as important players in who we advocate with and who we partner with and how they shape their spaces. Finally, one more example. You're familiar with the Panama Papers. That was an extraordinary act. Hundreds of journalists, dozens of countries, in real time. That's how work happens, folks. That's work. That's what it looks like. That's what civil society looks like. And we need to design for that. Now, all of this is possible when we recognize that we are dependent on these digital spaces and that we are just as capable of understanding the politics of them, the motivations of them, and the ways in which they shape our behavior. And all of you are capable of that. That's what civil society needs to understand. If your focus is on children, if your focus is on the arts, if your focus is on refugees, if your focus is on health, if your focus is on women, this is your agenda. Because you're doing it digitally, and it's shaping the space in which you work. And what we don't want to have happen, I'm going to skip through these, is a world in which we don't have all the choices we have about how to get somewhere, and we're dependent on a single choice. Right? And if we allow the tech companies and the government to solely design this space, we will be digitally captured. And that is not good for your work, your mission, or democracy. So please remember there are 4 things we need to work on. We need to work on them all simultaneously. All of you are experts on at least some of these. Some of you may be experts on all of them. And that is how we will invent digital civil society. Thank you very much.